Okay, welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into what I can only describe as a massive cultural earthquake. We're going to track this really fascinating historical shift from rigid early 20th century fundamentalism straight through to the global powerhouse we know today as modern evangelicalism. This isn't just some dry story about theology. We're talking about intense internal conflict, massive cultural shifts, and literally reshaping the modern religious landscape in ways that absolutely still influence our world right now. Let's get into it.
Just to set the stage here, listen to this intense, highly judgmental letter sent to Billy Graham by a guy named Andy Vandenberg. It totally hits the nail on the head when trying to understand the extreme, hyper-isolated environment of early fundamentalism. See, this wasn't just random hate mail from a troll. This was written by someone who genuinely, sincerely believed that his tiny, isolated church of maybe 100 people was literally the only true church left on Earth. In his mind, anyone outside that tiny bubble, even a famously devout evangelist like Billy Graham, was completely apostate and basically serving evil. It's a stark, frankly unbelievable look at the suffocating atmosphere of that era. And honestly, it's exactly that kind of intense isolation that birthed a desperate need for change.
So, to map this all out clearly, here's where we're headed. We'll start with those extremes of fundamentalism, look at the three major reactions that followed, dig into the five foundational pillars, and then explore the massive cultural forces of the 20th century. Finally, we'll wrap up by looking at a true crisis of confidence and meeting the key architects who built evangelicalism from the ground up.
All right, moving right into our first section, taking a hard look at the extremes of fundamentalism.
To really grasp why this movement had to change, you've got to understand the sheer hostility of the time. Get this. Back in 1971, a group called the Evangelical Theological Society reached out to Bob Jones University. Now, because that society was just open to engaging in basic social ministry and having some ecumenical dialogue with other Christians, the university didn't just politely decline. No, they essentially labeled this group of folks who were studying Scripture as the Antichrist. I mean, wow, it's genuinely astonishing to look back on. The fear of secular integration and cultural contamination was just so deeply hardwired into fundamentalism that it completely overrode any sense of shared community. Basically, if you weren't fully separated from society, you were the enemy.
So naturally, because of that intense hostility, fundamentalism started to fracture from the inside. Critics, many of whom grew up right inside this strict tradition, started raising their hands and pointing out some massive flaws. First off, they realized the movement was dangerously ahistorical. It was acting like 2,000 years of church history didn't even exist, tossing out centuries of profound thought. On top of that, it leaned way too heavily on fragile, superstar-driven personality cults and had this really imbalanced, almost obsessive focus on end-times prophecy. But perhaps the biggest breaking point? A total lack of social responsibility. Fundamentalists were terrified that helping the poor or pushing for social reform would dilute their spiritual message. For the internal critics, this just felt fundamentally unbiblical. It created this huge cognitive dissonance. Like, how could they claim to love their neighbors while actively refusing to actually help them, just out of a sheer fear of the secular world?
Which brings us to our second stop, the three major reactions to all of this.
So these extreme positions and all that internal pressure eventually forced a major historical crossroads. The movement basically splintered into three distinct paths. Path 1, some folks decided to stay put, remaining as internal critics trying to fix fundamentalism from the inside out. Path 2? Well, actually, let's skip to Path 3 for a second. Path 3 was a sharp, total liberal counterattack, abandoning the strict theology altogether. This liberal reaction was spearheaded by famous radio preachers like Harry Emerson Fosdick, who famously threw down the gauntlet with a massive sermon asking, "Shall the fundamentalists win?" So you had isolated fundamentalism on one end and a complete liberal rejection on the other. But the middle road, that's Path 2, is the absolute game changer for our explainer. This was a group that wanted to keep their core historical theology completely intact, but desperately wanted to ditch the bitter infighting and cultural isolation. That conscious separation, that became evangelicalism.
All right, Section 3. Let's look at the five foundations of this new movement.
Now, this new middle road wasn't just pulled out of thin air. It was actually a really careful layering of five distinct historical pillars. Let's walk through this theological DNA because it's super important. It all started with the 16th century reformers, borrowing their absolute focus on the authority of Scripture. Then they layered in the 17th century Pietist movement. If you aren't familiar with the Pietists, their whole goal was essentially to unite deep intellectual study with intense emotional devotion, basically getting the head and the heart to work together. Next up, they added the 18th century Wesleyan tradition, bringing this fiery, unstoppable passion for mass revival and reaching everyday people. Add to that the strict orthodox doctrines of the early 20th century fundamentalists. But here's the absolute crucial part. They added the final, missing puzzle piece, which was progressive engagement. Instead of hiding from society in a bunker, they actively wanted to train believers to be servant leaders out in the mainstream world, whether that's in law, medicine, politics, or education.
And what held all these diverse historical layers together? Well, it wasn't a single church building or a single leader. It was a shared ethos. Think of it almost like a massive open-source network. You could have people running entirely different denominational hardware, like Presbyterians, Baptists, Methodists, but they were all running the exact same operating system. They instantly clicked with each other because they shared a common language, a driving spirit of spiritual renewal, a deep passion for personal conversion, and a solid commitment to engaging the culture while staying firmly rooted in historic Christian doctrines.
Moving on to Section 4, the 20th century cultural forces that accelerated all of this.
Beyond just the theology, massive, real-world societal shifts in the 20th century provided the perfect fertile ground for this new movement to just absolutely explode. Picture the post-war era for a second. Returning GIs, the baby boom, the new interstate highway system, the rise of the suburbs. Everyday people suddenly owned homes, cars, and had unprecedented disposable income. The new evangelicals had to figure out, okay, how do we preach to this booming age of affluence without just selling some superficial health and wealth message? And at the exact same time, you had these massive populations migrating from rural farms straight into sprawling urban centers. The old agrarian small-town church approach just wasn't going to cut it in the city. So the movement pivoted hard. They started pouring heavy resources into what they called home missions, realizing they needed to tackle deep poverty, urban social needs, and cultural shifts right in their own backyards, instead of exclusively focusing on foreign missions overseas.
Which brings us to Section 5, a true crisis of confidence.
So these dramatic cultural forces soon collided head-on with a severe theological gap in the wider culture. Right at this moment in history, mainstream liberal theology had spent decades heavily critiquing and dissecting the biblical text. And it reached a point where the average person sitting in the pew felt like the church had no actual authority left and really no good news to offer. Everything was up for debate, nothing was certain. It created this profound, widespread cultural anxiety, a legitimate crisis of confidence. But evangelicalism confidently stepped right into that void. They offered exactly what people were desperately craving in a rapidly changing, chaotic modern world: an unwavering authority in the Bible, a highly structured worldview, and a crystal-clear, unapologetic gospel message. When everything else felt totally adrift, they provided a secure anchor.
And finally, Section 6, meeting the brilliant architects of evangelicalism.
To capitalize on these massive cultural forces, the movement needed some brilliant architects to build it. Enter Billy Graham, who became the undeniable public face of this new global institution. He looked at that massive post-war urbanization we were just talking about and realized, yeah, the old-school tent revivals aren't going to work anymore. So he pioneered the large-scale urban crusade. And guys, these were massive. We're talking about packing out gigantic sports stadiums, like Wembley in London or Madison Square Garden in New York night after night. He completely leveraged new media like radio and television, plus some unprecedented logistical organization to totally transform how the movement engaged with the modern world. He eventually became an international icon, celebrated for sure by totally secular publications like Time magazine.
But here's the insider secret of this era. While Billy Graham was the charismatic frontman smiling on all the magazine covers, the true strategic brain behind the scenes was a man named Harold John Okenga. Often called Mr. Evangelical, Okenga was essentially the CEO building the movement's massive supply chain. He realized that for evangelicalism to actually outlast a single generation, or, a single famous preacher, it needed serious, heavy-duty infrastructure. So he literally built it from the ground up. He founded the National Association of Evangelicals, became the first president of Fuller Theological Seminary, and even orchestrated the big Gordon-Conwell merger. He was the guy who ensured the movement had the high-level educational and organizational frameworks required to take evangelicalism out of the isolated shadows and put it squarely into the global spotlight.
So to wrap up this explainer, I really want to leave you with a provocative thought to chew on. When we look at how the modern church balances things like social responsibility, scriptural authority, and cultural engagement today, the literal blueprints were drawn during this exact era. It's just so fascinating how history lays the tracks for the present, isn't it? Considering the incredible transformation we've just mapped out, from extreme isolation to massive cultural engagement, how do you see these specific historical forces still shaping the cultural and religious debates we are experiencing right now? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. I hope it gave you a powerful new perspective on a truly massive cultural shift. Keep questioning and keep learning.